The thunder roared like a wounded beast as the stagecoach lurched violently across the swollen creek, the horses' panicked whinnies barely audible over the torrent of rainwater that had transformed the usually placid crossing into a raging river. Rebecca Montgomery clutched the leather strap hanging from the coach's ceiling, her knuckles white with terror as her fellow passengers shouted in alarm. She had known traveling to Montana Territory in 1878 during the spring rains was risky, but she hadn't anticipated anything like this. "Hold on!" the driver shouted from above, his voice nearly drowned by the storm. The coach tilted precariously as the current caught it, and Rebecca's heart leapt into her throat. She locked eyes with the elderly woman across from her, both of them sharing a moment of pure terror as they felt the vehicle being swept away. Everything happened at once, the sickening lurch as the coach tipped, the horses screaming, the splintering of wood and the rush of frigid water. Rebecca was thrown against the side of the coach as it rolled. Her head struck something hard, and darkness crowded the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the cold water rushing in, filling her lungs as she struggled to find air. Wade Wilson had been tracking the storm from his small cabin nestled in the foothills. At 32, he'd spent enough years in Montana Territory to recognize when the weather turned truly dangerous. The creek that cut through his property fed into the larger crossing several miles downstream, the same crossing the weekly stagecoach used on its route to Helena. When he noticed the water rising at an alarming rate, Wade didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance, and rode hard toward the crossing, praying he'd arrive before the stagecoach attempted to ford the swollen creek. The rain had plastered his duster to his broad shoulders, and his hat brim drooped from the weight of the water. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes, revealing the destruction ahead. Wade's stomach dropped when he spotted the overturned stagecoach, half submerged in the raging waters, debris scattered across the banks. "Hello," he shouted, dismounting and tying Chance to a cottonwood. "Anyone there?" The only response was the howl of the wind and the rush of the water. Wade waded into the shallows, fighting against the current as he approached the wreckage. He found the driver first, his body caught in the branches of a fallen tree downstream. The man's vacant eyes told Wade everything he needed to know. Returning to the coach, Wade peered inside through a shattered window. In the dim light, he could make out several bodies, but in the chaotic tangle of limbs and luggage, it was impossible to tell if anyone had survived. He braced himself against the current and pulled at the door, which finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal. That's when he saw her, a young woman pinned beneath an overturned bench, her face pale, dark hair floating around her like a halo in the murky water. Acting on instinct, Wade reached in and lifted the bench, freeing her body. With great effort, he pulled her from the wreckage and dragged her to the shore. She wasn't breathing. Panic seized him as he laid her on the riverbank, her soaked dress clinging to her slight frame. Wade had seen too much death in his life, first during his service in the war, then in the unforgiving wilderness of the frontier. He wasn't ready to witness another life slip away. "Come on," he muttered, turning her onto her side and firmly patting her back. "Breathe, damn it." As if responding to his command, the woman suddenly convulsed, water spewing from her mouth as she gasped and coughed. Wade turned her gently onto her back, relief washing over him as her eyelids fluttered. "You're breathing," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's it. Keep breathing." Her eyes opened briefly, striking green eyes that locked with his for just a moment before closing again. but she was alive, and that was what mattered. Wade checked the coach for other survivors, but found none. 6 souls lost to the unforgiving wilderness. He returned to the woman, who had fallen into unconsciousness again, though her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He had to get her somewhere warm and dry, and quickly. Lifting her in his arms, Wade carried her to Chance, who stood patiently beneath the cottonwood. With considerable effort, he mounted while holding her securely against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the chill of her skin even through his wet clothing. "Hold on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "My cabin's not far." The journey back was arduous. The rain continued to fall, though with less ferocity, and the terrain was treacherous with mud and newly formed gullies. Wade held the woman close, trying to shield her from the worst of the weather. By the time his cabin came into view, dusk was settling over the landscape, turning the stormy sky a deep, bruised purple. Inside, Wade worked quickly. He laid the woman on his bed and stoked the fire in the small stone hearth until it roared to life. Her clothing was soaked through, and her skin was alarmingly cold to the touch. With practiced efficiency born from years of survival in harsh conditions, Wade knew what needed to be done, though propriety made him hesitate. "Madam, I don't know if you can hear me," he said, "but your wet clothes need to come off or you'll catch your death." There was no response. With a resigned sigh, Wade retrieved his hunting knife and carefully cut away her dress, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible. He wrapped her in several thick blankets, then turned his attention to her head, where a nasty gash was still seeping blood. Wade cleaned and bandaged the wound, noting with concern the swelling around it. When he'd done all he could, he settled into a chair beside the bed to keep vigil. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the woman he'd pulled from the floodwaters. As he watched over her, Wade wondered who she was and what had brought her to this remote corner of the territory. She was well dressed, despite her travel-worn appearance, suggesting she came from money. Her hands were smooth and uncalloused, not the hands of someone accustomed to hard labor. A city woman, perhaps from back east. Whatever her story, she had nearly died today. And for reasons Wade couldn't quite articulate, he felt responsible for her now, at least until she recovered enough to continue her journey, if that was still her intention after such a harrowing ordeal. The night deepened, and Wade dozed fitfully in the chair, waking at the slightest sound. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, the woman began to moan, her head thrashing against the pillow. Wade was instantly alert, moving to her side and placing a cool cloth on her forehead. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and fever-bright. "The water," she whispered hoarsely. "Everyone drowning." "Don't try to talk," Wade urged. "Rest." But she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her gaze suddenly lucid. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Wade Wilson. You're in my cabin about 5 miles from where the stagecoach overturned. I pulled you out." Her eyes widened. "The others?" Wade hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her temples and into her hair. "All of them," she whispered. "I couldn't find any other survivors," he confirmed gently. "The current was too strong." A sob escaped her, and Wade felt helpless in the face of her grief. He'd never been good at offering comfort, not since Clara died all those years ago. The memory of his wife, taken by fever just 2 years into their marriage, was a wound that had never fully healed. "I didn't even know them," the woman said, her voice breaking. "Just met them on the coach. But they were people with families, with lives. It wasn't your fault," Wade said. "The creek was swollen from the rains. Nobody should have tried to cross it." She nodded weakly, then winced, her hand going to her bandaged head. "I feel strange. You took a hard knock to the head and you swallowed half the creek, I reckon. You need to rest." As if his words had sapped the last of her strength, she sank back against the pillow, her eyes drifting closed. "Thank you," she murmured before slipping back into unconsciousness. Wade watched her for a long moment, noticing the flush of fever on her cheeks. She wasn't out of danger yet. With a sigh, he returned to his chair, prepared for a long night ahead. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. The woman's fever spiked dangerously high, and Wade feared the head wound had caused more damage than he'd initially thought. He bathed her forehead with cool water, forced broth between her parched lips when she was lucid enough to swallow, and changed the dressing on her wound. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Wade awoke from a fitful sleep in his chair to find her watching him, her green eyes clear for the first time since the accident. "You look terrible," she said, her voice weak but steady. A startled laugh escaped him. "You're one to talk." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "How long have I been here?" 4 days, Wade replied, rising to pour a cup of water from the pitcher beside the bed. "Here, drink this, slowly." She tried to sit up but fell back with a grimace. Wade slipped an arm behind her shoulders, supporting her as she drank. He was acutely aware of her vulnerability, dressed only in one of his clean shirts and wrapped in blankets. "I'm Rebecca Montgomery," she said after she'd drained the cup, "though my friends call me Becca." "Where were you headed, Miss Montgomery?" "Helena," she replied. "My uncle owns a mercantile there. I was coming to help him run it." Wade nodded. Helena was a growing town, the territorial capital, about 30 miles north of his cabin. "I can get word to him when the weather clears. Let him know you're alive." Rebecca's expression clouded. "He doesn't know I was coming. It was meant to be a surprise," she sighed. "A foolish one, apparently." "Not foolish," Wade corrected. "Just unfortunate timing with the rains." She studied him, taking in his weathered face, the flecks of gray at his temples, the quiet strength in his bearing. "You saved my life, Mr. Wilson." "Wade," he insisted. "And anyone would have done the same." "No," she said softly. "Not anyone. And certainly not with the care you've shown since." Her cheeks colored slightly as she glanced down at her borrowed attire. "I assume you." "I tried to be respectful," Wade said quickly, his own face warming. "Your clothes were soaked, and you were half frozen." Rebecca nodded, accepting his explanation. "Thank you. For everything." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Wade cleared his throat and stood. "You should rest more. I'll make some food. You need your strength back." As he busied himself at the small stove, Wade felt Rebecca's eyes on him. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with anyone, let alone a woman. His cabin, while sturdy and well-built, was Spartan, a testament to his solitary existence. A table with 2 chairs, a chest for his few possessions, shelves lined with practical items, and a single bed. No decorations adorned the walls, no feminine touches softened the rough-hewn logs. Clara would have hated it, he thought with a pang. She'd always loved pretty things, had made their small home in Kansas a place of warmth and beauty despite their limited means. After her death, Wade had enlisted, seeking the oblivion of war. When that was over, he drifted west, eventually settling in this remote corner of Montana territory where the rugged landscape matched his inner desolation. "You live alone," Rebecca observed, interrupting his thoughts. Wade nodded, stirring the pot of rabbit stew he'd prepared the day before. "Just me and Chance, my horse. No family." "Not anymore." Something in his tone must have warned her not to press further, for she changed the subject. "What do you do out here, so far from town?" "Hunt, trap, do some prospecting," Wade replied, grateful for the shift. "I guide for hunting parties sometimes when they come through." "It's enough." "Sounds lonely," Rebecca said softly. Wade shrugged. "I prefer the quiet." When the stew was hot, he brought a bowl to Rebecca, again helping her to sit up. Her weakness concerned him. The ordeal had taken a greater toll on her body than he'd initially realized. "I can feed myself," she protested when he dipped the spoon into the stew. "Can you?" Wade challenged, raising an eyebrow. Rebecca attempted to take the spoon from him, but her hand trembled visibly. With a frustrated sigh, she relented. "Perhaps not yet." Wade fed her slowly, aware of the intimacy of the act. It reminded him of caring for Clara in her final days, and the memory both ached and comforted him. Rebecca ate only a small amount before turning her head away. "That's all I can manage for now," she said apologetically. "It's a start," Wade assured her, setting the bowl aside. "Your strength will return gradually." Over the next few days, Rebecca improved steadily. She began to stay awake for longer periods, ate more at each meal, and even managed to sit up without assistance. Wade found himself enjoying their conversations, which ranged from her life in St. Louis, where she'd been raised by her mother after her father's death, to his experiences in the war and his travels throughout the Western territories. Rebecca was intelligent and well-read, with opinions on everything from politics to literature. She spoke passionately about her desire to make her own way in the world, rather than following the expected path of marriage to one of the suitable bachelors her mother had paraded before her. "That's why I came west," she explained one evening as they sat by the fire, Rebecca propped up in bed while Wade occupied his usual chair. "Uncle Henry wrote that he needed help with his business, and I saw my opportunity for independence." "Your mother didn't object?" Rebecca laughed, a melodious sound that Wade found himself wanting to hear again. "Objected?" She was apoplectic. Said no decent man would marry a woman who'd traveled alone to such a wild place. Her smile faded. "She wasn't wrong about the dangers, it seems." "The territory can be harsh," Wade acknowledged, "but it has its own beauty and rewards for those willing to face its challenges." "Like you?" Rebecca asked, studying him curiously. Wade shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "I suppose." "What brought you here, Wade?" "Really?" He was silent for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "After the war, I couldn't settle back into normal life. Everything seemed small, pointless." He shrugged. "Out here, life is simpler. You survive or you don't, no pretense." "And the solitude?" "Suits me." Rebecca didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject. "I need to get word to my uncle soon. He'll be expecting supplies that were on that coach, even if he wasn't expecting me." "The creek should be passable in another day or two if the rain holds off," Wade said. "I can ride into town then." "Thank you." As promised, 2 days later, Wade prepared to ride to Helena. The skies had cleared, and though the ground was still muddy, the creek had receded to safer levels. Rebecca, Now able to move around the cabin with the aid of a stick Wade had fashioned into a cane, watched as he readied his saddlebags. "I've written a letter for Uncle Henry," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. "And I've made a list of things I need, if you wouldn't mind purchasing them. I have money." Wade took the list, scanning it quickly. Basic necessities, clothing, personal items, a few luxuries like soap and hairpins. "I'll get what I can find." "Anything in particular for the clothing?" Rebecca blushed slightly. "Just something practical. I trust your judgment." The thought of selecting women's clothing was daunting, but Wade nodded. "I'll be back by tomorrow evening. There's food prepared and plenty of firewood stacked by the door." "I'll be fine, Wade," she assured him. "I'm much stronger now." Still, he hesitated at the door, suddenly reluctant to leave her alone. "If anyone comes by—" "I know," Rebecca interrupted. "Stay inside and keep your rifle close." She gestured to the weapon he'd shown her how to load and fire, just in case, though I doubt anyone will find their way here. "All the same," Wade insisted, "be careful." The journey to Helena took longer than usual due to the muddy conditions, but Wade reached the territorial capital by mid-afternoon. The town had grown considerably since his last visit, with new buildings sprouting along Last Chance Gulch, the main thoroughfare. Gold had been discovered here in 1864, and though the initial boom had subsided, Helena remained a thriving center of commerce and government. He located Montgomery Mercantile easily enough, a substantial two-story building on the corner of the main street. Inside, the store was well stocked with everything from foodstuffs to mining equipment, clothing to household goods. A balding man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard stood behind the counter, assisting a customer. Wade waited his turn, taking in the organized chaos of the mercantile. When the customer departed, Wade approached, letter in hand. "Mr. Montgomery." The man adjusted his spectacles. "Henry Montgomery, at your service. What can I help you with today?" Wade placed Rebecca's letter on the counter. "I have news about your niece." Henry's expression shifted from polite interest to concern. "Rebecca? What about her?" His eyes widened as he glanced at the letter. "Is she here in Helena?" "No, sir. She was on the stagecoach that was caught in the flood 4 days back." The color drained from Henry's face. Dear God, there were reports. They said everyone perished. "Not everyone," Wade assured him quickly. "Miss Montgomery survived. She's recovering at my cabin, about 30 miles south of here." Henry snatched up the letter with trembling hands, breaking the seal and reading its contents rapidly. Relief washed over his features, followed by concern. She was injured? Head wound, and she swallowed a lot of water, had a fever for several days. She's on the mend now, though still weak. "Thank God," Henry murmured, then looked at Wade with renewed interest. "And you are?" "Wade Wilson. I was tracking the storm, saw the coach overturn." Henry extended his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I am in your debt. Rebecca is the only family I have left." He shook Wade's hand vigorously. "You must tell me everything." Wade recounted the events of that day and Rebecca's subsequent recovery, omitting certain details out of respect for her privacy. Henry listened intently, his expression alternating between horror at the circumstances and gratitude for Wade's intervention. "I must come get her immediately," Henry declared when Wade had finished. "She's not fit for travel yet," Wade cautioned. "The road's still bad and she tires easily. Give her another week at least." Henry frowned, clearly torn between concern and impatience. "You're certain she's comfortable?" Safe? As comfortable as my humble cabin allows, Wade replied honestly. And yes, she's safe. After further discussion, Henry reluctantly agreed to wait 1 week before coming to collect his niece. In the meantime, he insisted on providing Wade with supplies far more than Rebecca had requested on her list. "It's the least I can do," Henry said, waving away Wade's protests as he instructed his clerk to pack a substantial order. "I was beginning to think something terrible had happened when the stage didn't arrive on schedule." He sighed heavily. "Poor child, what an ordeal. And to think I didn't even know she was coming." "She mentioned it was meant to be a surprise," Wade said. Henry smiled sadly. "That's Rebecca. Always doing the unexpected." His expression grew serious. "Her mother, my sister, passed away 3 months ago. I wrote suggesting Rebecca come west afterward, but I never received a reply. I assumed she'd chosen to remain in St. Louis with her mother's family." The news of Rebecca's mother's death gave Wade pause. She hadn't mentioned it in their conversations. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Thank you." Henry busied himself with some paperwork, perhaps to hide his emotion. "Now, about your payment for caring for my niece." "That's not necessary," Wade interrupted. "Nonsense," Henry insisted. "I won't hear of it. In addition to these supplies, I insist you accept this." He counted out a substantial sum from the cash drawer. Wade shook his head. "I didn't help your niece for money, Mr. Montgomery." "Then consider it compensation for the inconvenience," Henry persisted, pushing the money across the counter, "and for the supplies you've already used caring for her." Realizing the older man wouldn't be deterred, Wade reluctantly accepted half the offered amount, tucking it into his pocket. "Thank you." By the time all the purchases were complete and loaded onto Chance, the sun was beginning to set. Henry had insisted on including a small trunk of clothing for Rebecca dresses, undergarments, a warm coat, and sturdy boots, along with personal items he thought she might need or want. The load was considerably more than Wade had anticipated bringing back, but Chance was strong and sure-footed. "I'll see you in 1 week," Henry said as Wade prepared to depart. "Take care of her. Mr. Wilson?" "I will," Wade promised, feeling the weight of the man's trust. Night had fallen by the time Wade left Helena, but the full moon provided enough light to navigate the familiar trail. He made camp after several hours, stopping at a sheltered spot he'd used before. As he sat by his small fire, eating a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, his thoughts turned to Rebecca. In the short time he'd known her, she'd somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself. Her presence in his cabin had transformed the space, filling it with conversation and laughter. The prospect of her leaving, while inevitable, left him with an unexpected sense of loss. "Don't be a fool, Wilson," he muttered to himself, kicking dirt over the fire before settling into his bedroll. She was never meant to stay. Wade reached his cabin the following evening, later than he'd planned due to the heavy load and deteriorating trail. Smoke curled from the chimney, and lamplight glowed in the window, a welcoming sight after the long journey. He was unprepared for the rush of emotion he felt when he opened the door and found Rebecca seated by the fire, a book in her lap. She looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him, and Wade felt something shift inside his chest. "You're back," she said, setting aside the book and rising to her feet with the aid of her makeshift cane. "As promised," Wade replied, shrugging off his wet coat. Outside, a light drizzle had begun to fall, threatening to develop into another storm. "I have news and supplies more than you asked for," Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "Oh, I met your uncle," Wade explained, moving to stoke the fire. "He's well, though he was shocked to learn what happened. He didn't know you were coming." "I sent a letter," Rebecca said, frowning. "It must have gone astray." Wade nodded. "He wants to come for you in a week. I told him you weren't fit for travel yet." A strange expression crossed Rebecca's face, relief mingled with something like disappointment. "A week," she repeated. "I suppose that's sensible." Wade busied himself bringing in the supplies, unable to decipher her reaction. Was she eager to leave his crude cabin, or reluctant to face her new life in Helena after her harrowing experience? He couldn't tell, and it wasn't his place to ask. When he brought in the trunk of clothing, Rebecca's eyes widened. "What's this?" "From your uncle," Wade explained. "He insisted on sending everything he thought you might need." Rebecca ran her hand over the polished wood of the trunk, her expression unreadable. How thoughtful of him. The rain was falling harder now, drumming on the roof of the cabin. Wade secured the door and hung his damp coat to dry. "Are you hungry? I can prepare something." "I've already made supper," Rebecca said, gesturing to the pot hanging over the fire. "It's nothing fancy, just a stew with some of the vegetables from your garden." Wade was taken aback. He hadn't expected her to cook, especially given her still healing condition. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," she said simply. "It was the least I could do after all you've done for me." They ate in companionable silence, the rain creating a soothing backdrop to their meal. Wade was impressed with the stew. Rebecca had seasoned it perfectly with herbs from his small garden, and the result was better than his own usual fare. "This is good," he said, reaching for a second helping. "You're a fine cook." Rebecca smiled, pleased by the compliment. "My mother insisted I learn domestic skills, even though I was more interested in books and numbers." Her smile faltered slightly at the mention of her mother. Wade hesitated, then said gently, "Your uncle told me about your mother's passing. I'm sorry." Rebecca's spoon stilled and she stared into her bowl. "Thank you. It was unexpected. A winter fever that turned to pneumonia." She took a deep breath. "That's partly why I decided to come west. There was nothing keeping me in St. Louis anymore, and Uncle Henry's letter offering me work seemed like providence." "He seems like a good man," Wade observed. "He was very concerned about you." "He is," Rebecca agreed. "He and my mother weren't close. They disagreed about many things, particularly her choice of husband. But he always remembered my birthdays, sent gifts at Christmas." She smiled fondly. "Once, when I was 12, he sent me a book of poems by Emily Dickinson. Mother was scandalized. She thought the poems too provocative for a young girl. But I treasured that book." Wade found himself smiling at her story. "You've always had a rebellious streak then?" Rebecca laughed. "I prefer to think of it as an independent mind." After supper, Rebecca opened the trunk, exclaiming over her uncle's thoughtfulness. There were dresses suitable for both everyday wear and more formal occasions, practical undergarments, nightgowns, a warm shawl, and even a small selection of books. "He remembered," she said softly, holding up a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. "I mentioned once in a letter that I'd lost my copy in a move." Wade watched her from his chair by the fire, struck by how the simple act of unpacking her new belongings seemed to restore some of her spirit. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she moved with more confidence, though she still relied on the cane for support. "I think I'll change into proper night clothes," Rebecca declared, selecting a modest white nightgown from the trunk. If you'll excuse me for a moment, Wade nodded, rising to his feet. I'll step outside. In this rain? Rebecca asked, looking concerned. That's not necessary. Just turn your back if you wouldn't mind. Feeling suddenly awkward, Wade did as she asked, facing the door with his hands clasped behind him. He could hear the rustle of fabric as she changed, and he kept his gaze fixed firmly on the grain of the wooden door. You can turn around now, Rebecca said after a few minutes. She stood by the bed, the white nightgown falling to her ankles, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Wade had never seen her with her hair down before. She'd kept it braided since regaining enough strength to tend to it herself. The effect was striking. She looked younger, more vulnerable, yet somehow more herself. I should get some rest, she said, her cheeks flushing slightly under his gaze. Thank you again for bringing all these things, Wade. You're welcome, he replied, his voice gruff. I'll sleep by the fire tonight. Rebecca frowned. You've been sleeping in that chair for over a week because of me. You must be exhausted. Wade shrugged. I've slept in worse conditions. At least take some of these blankets, she insisted, retrieving several from the bed. The nights are getting colder. Their hands brushed as she passed him the blankets, and Wade felt an electric jolt at the contact. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, suggesting she'd felt it too. For a moment they stood frozen, the blankets between them like a tenuous bridge. Then Rebecca stepped back, breaking the spell. Good night, Wade. Good night, Rebecca. In the days that followed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Rebecca grew stronger with each passing day, gradually requiring the cane less and less. She insisted on taking on more household tasks, cooking, mending, even attempting to tidy Wade's already Spartan cabin. For his part, Wade found himself lingering longer than necessary between his usual chores, drawn back to the cabin by the novel experience of having someone to talk with, someone who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts and experiences. They spent evenings by the fire, Rebecca reading aloud from one of her books or telling stories of her childhood in St. Louis, while Wade worked on small woodworking projects or cleaned his firearms. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow connected by the shared space and the crackling hearth. On the fourth day, after Wade's return from Helena, Rebecca asked if she could accompany him on his rounds checking his traps. It's a fair distance, Wade cautioned, and the ground's still muddy in places. I need to build my strength, she insisted, and I'd like to see more of your land. Unable to deny her reasonable request, Wade agreed. He helped her onto Chance, then mounted behind her, acutely aware of her body pressed against his as they rode out. Rebecca's hair, tied back in a simple braid, smelled of the lavender soap her uncle had included among her supplies. Wade found himself inhaling deeply, committing the scent to memory. The day was clear, the recent rains having washed the landscape to a vibrant green. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and birds called from the scattered pines. Wade showed Rebecca his favorite spots, a rocky outcropping with a view across the valley, a hidden pond teeming with trout, a stand of aspen whose leaves shimmered like gold coins in the breeze. It's beautiful, Rebecca said as they paused at the edge of a small meadow. I can see why you chose this place. Wade nodded, seeing his familiar surroundings through her appreciative eyes. It has everything a man needs: water, game, shelter from the worst weather. And solitude, Rebecca added softly. That too, he acknowledged, though I find I mind it less these days. Their eyes met, and Wade saw understanding in her gaze. They'd both lost people they loved, had both sought new beginnings in this untamed territory. In that moment, the connection between them felt tangible, like a rope bridge spanning a chasm neither had expected to cross. The spell was broken by a sudden movement in the brush ahead. Wade's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but he relaxed when a doe and her fawn stepped cautiously into the meadow. "Oh," Rebecca breathed, going still against him, "they're lovely." They watched in silence as the deer grazed, unaware of their presence. The fawn pranced around its mother, all gangly legs and boundless energy. After several minutes, the doe raised her head, sensing their presence, and bounded away with her offspring. "Thank you for showing me this," Rebecca said as they continued their journey. "It's good to be reminded that there's still beauty in the world, even after tragedy." Wade thought about her words long after they'd returned to the cabin. He'd come to these mountains seeking isolation after Clara's death and the horrors of war, believing beauty and connection were luxuries he no longer deserved. But Rebecca's presence had awakened something in him, a yearning he'd thought long buried. That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, Rebecca brought out a deck of cards she'd found among her uncle's gifts. "Do you play?" she asked, shuffling with surprising dexterity. "Not in years," Wade admitted, "but I remember the basics." They played several hands of a simple game, Rebecca keeping score on a scrap of paper. When Wade won the third round, she narrowed her eyes playfully. "I think you're pretending to be rusty, Mr. Wilson." He chuckled, gathering the cards for his turn to deal. "Would I do such a thing, Miss Montgomery?" "I think you would," she retorted, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "You're full of surprises." "As are you," he replied, more seriously than he'd intended. Rebecca's smile softened. "What surprises you about me?" Wade considered the question as he dealt the cards. "Your resilience," he said finally. "Most city women would have fallen to pieces after what you endured." "I'm not most women," Rebecca said, arranging her cards. "No," Wade agreed, meeting her gaze over his hand. "You certainly are not." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, charged with unspoken feelings. Rebecca's cheeks flushed, and she looked away first, focusing intently on her cards. Wade did the same, though he found it difficult to concentrate on the game. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Rebecca in the bed, Wade on his makeshift pallet by the fire, she said hesitantly, "Wade?" "Yes?" "When I leave, would it be all right if I wrote to you?" The question caught him off guard. "You'd want to?" Rebecca nodded, her expression earnest in the flickering firelight. "I would. I've come to value your friendship." Friendship. The word both warmed and wounded him, for he realized his feelings had grown beyond friendship, though he had no right to expect more. "I'd like that," he said simply. Rebecca smiled, relieved. "Good night, then." "Good night, Rebecca." The day of Henry Montgomery's expected arrival dawned clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air. Rebecca was up early, dressed in one of her new dresses of practical navy blue wool with a white collar. She'd braided her hair neatly and packed her few belongings in the trunk. Wade observed these preparations with a heavy heart, though he kept his expression neutral. "Your uncle should be here by midday," he said over breakfast. "The trail's much improved since last week." Rebecca nodded, pushing her food around her plate without eating much. "Yes, I expect he'll be prompt. He always was in his letters." An awkward silence fell between them, laden with things unsaid. Wade wanted to tell her how much her presence had meant to him, how she'd brought life back to his solitary existence, but the words stuck in his throat. What right did a scarred, solitary man like him have to burden her with such feelings? "I should check on Chance," he said abruptly, rising from the table. "He seemed a bit off his feed this morning." Outside, Wade leaned against the corral fence, watching as Chance grazed peacefully, showing no signs of distress. He'd lied to escape the tension in the cabin, to gather his thoughts before Rebecca's departure. But no matter how he tried to prepare himself, he knew her leaving would leave a void in his life. He was still standing there when Rebecca joined him, her footsteps hesitant on the packed earth of the yard. "Is he all right?" she asked, nodding toward Chance. "Fine," Wade admitted. "I just needed some air." Rebecca moved to stand beside him, her arm brushing his as she leaned on the fence. "It's a beautiful day for travel," she observed, gazing out across the landscape. "It is," Wade agreed. "A perfect day for beginnings," he thought. "Or endings." "Wade," Rebecca began, turning to face him, "I want to thank you properly, not just for saving my life, but for all you've done since. Your kindness, your patience." "You don't need to thank me," Wade interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "But I do," she insisted, placing her hand on his arm. "You could have left me at the nearest settlement or sent word to my uncle immediately. Instead, you cared for me, shared your home, your food, your stories." Her eyes searched his face. "You gave me time to heal not just my body, but my spirit." Wade looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her earnest face. "I'm glad I could help," he said simply. Rebecca's expression faltered slightly, as if she'd expected or hoped for a different response. She withdrew her hand. "Yes, well, I suppose I should finish getting ready." She turned to go, and something in Wade broke free. "Rebecca, wait." She paused, looking back at him with a question in her eyes. He faltered, then took a deep breath. "These past 2 weeks having you here, I've been alone a long time. By choice, I thought. But now," she prompted softly. "Now I'm not sure I can go back to that solitude," Wade confessed, the words tumbling out before he could reconsider. "You've changed something in me, Rebecca, awakened something I thought was dead." Rebecca's eyes widened, hope dawning in their green depths. "Wade, are you saying—" "I'm saying I care for you," he interrupted, needing to get the words out before courage failed him. "More than I should, perhaps. More than makes sense given how short a time we've known each other." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to express himself eloquently. "I don't expect you to feel the same. I know you have plans, a future in Helena with your uncle. I needed you to know." Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his face. "What if I told you I feel the same way?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wade stared at her, scarcely daring to believe what he was hearing. "You do?" She nodded, a smile blooming on her face. "I do. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you, but I was afraid you saw me only as a burden, an unwanted responsibility." "Never," Wade said fervently. "Never that." Their gazes locked, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, Wade reached out to cup her cheek in his calloused hand. Rebecca leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "May I?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Rebecca rose onto her tiptoes, her hands coming to rest on his chest as their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss. It was brief, almost chaste, but it sent a current of feeling through Wade that left him breathless. When they parted, Rebecca's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I don't want to leave," she confessed. "Then don't," Wade replied, his heart pounding. "Stay, at least until you're sure of what you want." Rebecca shook her head. "My uncle is expecting me. He's coming all this way." "We'll explain," Wade said, taking her hands in his. "He seems like a reasonable man, if he cares for your happiness." "It's not that simple," Rebecca interrupted gently. "I came west to work with him to make a new life. I can't abandon that commitment on a whim." "This isn't a whim," Wade protested. "No," she agreed, squeezing his hands. "It's not. But I need time, Wade. Time to fulfill my promise to Uncle Henry. Time to be sure of what I truly want." She gazed up at him earnestly. "Can you understand that?" Though it pained him, Wade nodded. "I can. And I'll wait, Rebecca. As long as it takes." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Thank you." They were still standing there, hands clasped, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them. Reluctantly, they stepped apart as a wagon came into view, driven by Henry Montgomery himself. The older man pulled up in front of the cabin, setting the brake before climbing down from the seat. He was dressed for travel in sturdy clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, his spectacles glinting in the sunlight. "Rebecca," he called, his face lighting up at the sight of his niece. "My dear girl, thank God you're safe." Rebecca moved forward to embrace her uncle, who hugged her tightly, murmuring words of relief and affection. Wade hung back, giving them space for their reunion, though his eyes never left Rebecca. When they finally separated, Henry turned to Wade, extending his hand. "Mr. Wilson, I can't thank you enough for what you've done." Wade shook their offered hand. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Henry said firmly, echoing Rebecca's earlier words. "Not anyone. You're a rare man, Mr. Wilson." He glanced between Wade and Rebecca, a knowing look in his eyes. "And I suspect my niece has come to the same conclusion." Rebecca blushed, but she didn't deny her uncle's observation. "Uncle Henry, there's something we should discuss before we leave." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Perhaps we should go inside," Rebecca suggested, gesturing toward the cabin. The three of them settled around Wade's small table, Rebecca serving coffee she'd prepared earlier. With remarkable composure, she explained her feelings for Wade and his for her, their desire to explore what was developing between them, and her conflicted sense of duty toward her uncle's offer of employment. Henry listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. When Rebecca finished speaking, he turned to Wade. "And your intentions toward my niece, Mr. Wilson, they are honorable, I trust." "Completely," Wade assured him, meeting the older man's gaze steadily. "I care deeply for Rebecca. I want only what will make her happy." Henry nodded, apparently satisfied. He drummed his fingers on the table, considering. "Well, this is unexpected, but not unwelcome." He smiled at Rebecca's surprised expression. "My dear, did you think I would object to your finding happiness after all you've endured?" "I thought you might feel I was abandoning our arrangement," Rebecca admitted. Henry waved a dismissive hand. "The mercantile has survived this long without your assistance. It can manage a while longer." His expression grew more serious. "However, I do have concerns about your living situation, should you choose to stay." Wade straightened in his chair. "Sir, I would never compromise Rebecca's reputation. If she decides to stay, I would find her suitable accommodations in town until—" He hesitated, then continued resolutely. "Until we determine if our feelings might lead to marriage." Rebecca's eyes widened at his words, but there was no disapproval in her expression, only a soft wonder, as if she were seeing a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Henry stroked his beard thoughtfully. "That seems a reasonable approach." He turned to his niece. "Rebecca, what do you wish to do?" Rebecca looked between the two men, her expression resolute. "I want to honor my commitment to you, Uncle Henry, but I also want to explore what Wade and I might have together." She took a deep breath. "Perhaps there's a compromise." "What do you propose?" Henry asked. "I could come to Helena as planned, work in the mercantile during the week, and perhaps visit Wade on weekends." She glanced at Wade uncertainly. "If that would be acceptable?" Wade nodded, relief washing over him. It wasn't ideal, but it would allow them time together, time to build on what had already begun between them. More than acceptable. Henry considered the proposal, then nodded slowly. "It could work. My home has plenty of room for you, Rebecca, and Mr. Wilson would be welcome to visit as well, of course." He smiled at their surprised expressions. "I'm not so old-fashioned as you might think, and I remember what it was to be young and in love." "Thank you, Uncle," Rebecca said, visibly moved by his understanding. They spent the remainder of the day finalizing arrangements. Henry would take Rebecca to Helena as planned, where she would settle into his home and begin working at the mercantile. Wade would ride into town the following weekend, and they would see each other regularly thereafter. If, after a suitable period, their feelings remained unchanged or had deepened, they would discuss more permanent arrangements. As the afternoon waned, it was time for Rebecca and Henry to depart if they hoped to reach Helena before nightfall. Wade helped load Rebecca's trunk onto the wagon, his movements deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable. When everything was ready, Henry tactfully busied himself checking the harness, giving Wade and Rebecca a moment alone. "A week isn't so long," Rebecca said, trying to sound cheerful despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "The longest week of my life," Wade replied, taking her hands in his. Rebecca smiled through her tears. "Write to me? I want to know what you're doing, what you're thinking." "I'm not much of a letter writer," Wade admitted, "but for you I'll try." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "This isn't goodbye, Wade. It's just until next week." Wade nodded, covering her hand with his own. "Until next week." They kissed once more, a lingering, tender kiss that held the promise of many more to come. When they parted, Wade helped Rebecca into the wagon beside her uncle, who nodded respectfully to him before flicking the reins. Wade stood in the yard long after the wagon had disappeared from view, the taste of Rebecca's kiss still on his lips, her scent lingering in the air around him. For the first time in years, he felt a sensation he'd almost forgotten: hope. True to his word, Wade rode into Helena the following weekend. He'd spent the week making improvements to his cabin, repairing the roof, building a proper table and chairs, adding shelves for Rebecca's books. He wasn't sure what the future held, but if there was a chance she might one day share his home, he wanted it to be worthy of her. Rebecca was waiting for him outside the mercantile, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than he was used to seeing. She looked both familiar and new, and Wade's heart quickened at the sight of her. Their reunion was joyous but restrained by the public setting. Henry invited Wade to stay for dinner, and the three of them spent a pleasant evening in the Montgomery home, a comfortable two-story house behind the mercantile. Wade was impressed by the easy rapport between Rebecca and her uncle, the way they seemed to complement each other's personalities and skills. Rebecca has already proven invaluable at the store, Henry told Wade over coffee after dinner. She reorganized our bookkeeping system in just 3 days, something I've been meaning to do for years. Rebecca smiled modestly. Uncle Henry is too kind. I simply applied what I learned helping manage my mother's household accounts. Don't diminish your accomplishments, Henry admonished gently. Mr. Wilson should know what a capable woman he's courting. Wade smiled at Rebecca. I'm well aware of her many virtues, sir. The weekend passed too quickly. Wade and Rebecca managed a few precious hours alone, walking through Helena's streets, sharing their experiences of the week apart. On Sunday afternoon, before Wade had to depart, they strolled to a scenic overlook on the edge of town. Are you happy here? Wade asked as they gazed out over the valley. Rebecca considered the question. I'm finding my place, she said carefully. Uncle Henry is kind and the work is interesting. She turned to face Wade. But I miss our evenings by the fire, the quiet of your land, the stars at night. I miss you, Wade said simply. The cabin feels empty without you. Rebecca stepped closer, slipping her hand into his. Then I'll have to visit soon, won't I? Uncle Henry suggested I might spend next weekend at your cabin, if you're amenable. He says he can manage the store for a couple of days. Wade's eyebrows rose. Your uncle is a surprisingly progressive man. He values happiness above convention, Rebecca explained, and he trusts both of us to behave honorably. As we will, Wade assured her, though the thought of having Rebecca in his cabin again, this time by choice rather than necessity, sent his pulse racing. They parted with a kiss and a promise to write during the week ahead. Wade rode home with a lighter heart, the landscape seeming more vibrant, more alive than it had on the journey to town. Over the next months, their relationship deepened through weekends spent together, either at Wade's cabin or in Helena. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and histories. Wade told Rebecca about Clara, about the war, about the years of wandering before he found his place in the Montana wilderness. Rebecca shared stories of her mother, her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams for the future. As winter approached, bringing with it the threat of snow that could make travel between Helena and Wade's cabin impossible for weeks at a time, they faced a decision. Their feelings for each other had only strengthened. Neither had any doubt about wanting a life together. The question was where and how that life would take shape. I've been thinking, Wade said one evening as they sat by the fire in his cabin. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted lazily from a leaden sky. About our future, Rebecca looked up from her book, her expression attentive. As have I. Wade took a deep breath. I know you've built a life in Helena. You're good at what you do, and your uncle values your help. But, Rebecca prompted gently. But I can't imagine living in town, Wade admitted. The noise, the closeness of everything. He shook his head. I've tried it before. It doesn't suit me. Rebecca set her book aside, moving to kneel before him. I know, Wade. I wouldn't ask you to change who you are. He took her hands in his, and I wouldn't ask you to give up the life you've made. So I've been thinking of a compromise. Tell me, she urged. There's land for sale, about halfway between here and Helena, Wade explained. Good land with water and timber, close enough to town for you to continue working with your uncle, but far enough out to have the space and quiet I need. Rebecca's eyes widened. You'd move? For us, yes, Wade said. I could build us a proper house, nothing fancy, but comfortable. Maybe raise some cattle, do some farming. He searched her face anxiously. What do you think? I think, Rebecca said slowly, that I need to ask you something first. Wade nodded, suddenly nervous. Rebecca took a deep breath. Wade Wilson, are you asking me to marry you? A smile spread across Wade's face. I suppose I am, in my roundabout way. He squeezed her hands gently. Rebecca Montgomery, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she said without hesitation, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Yes, I will marry you, Wade. He pulled her into his arms, his heart so full he thought it might burst. They held each other for a long moment, the fire crackling beside them, the snow falling silently outside. When? Rebecca asked finally, her voice muffled against his shoulder. As soon as possible, Wade replied, before winter makes travel impossible. Rebecca laughed, pulling back to look at him. Uncle Henry will want to host the wedding. He's grown quite fond of you, you know. And I of him, Wade acknowledged. I'll speak to him about my plans for the new land when we return to Helena. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Henry Montgomery's home, with a small gathering of Helena's residents in attendance. Rebecca wore a gown of ivory silk that Henry had ordered specially from St. Louis, and Wade wore a new suit that felt stiff and unfamiliar, but worth the discomfort for the look of appreciation in his bride's eyes. After a brief honeymoon at Wade's cabin, soon to be their former home, they began work on their new property. The land Wade had purchased sat in a picturesque valley with a year-round stream running through it, about an hour's ride from Helena. With Henry's financial backing and Wade's building skills, they constructed a comfortable house with plenty of room for future growth. By spring, they were settled in their new home. Wade had started a small herd of cattle and planted a garden twice the size of his old one. Rebecca continued to work at the mercantile 3 days a week, riding into town on the sturdy mare Wade had bought for her as a wedding gift. The arrangement suited them perfectly. Rebecca maintained her connection to town life and her beloved uncle, while Wade had the space and freedom he craved. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Rebecca took Wade's hand and placed it on her still flat abdomen. I have news, she said softly. Wade's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Are you certain? Rebecca nodded, her face glowing with happiness. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. By winter we'll be 3. Joy unlike anything Wade had ever known surged through him. He gathered Rebecca into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. A family, he murmured against her hair. Our family. Yes, Rebecca agreed, leaning back to look into his eyes. Who would have thought when you pulled me from that flooded stagecoach that we'd end up here? Wade thought back to that stormy day, to the moment when he'd found her lifeless body in the wreckage and feared she was gone. You're breathing, he'd said then, relief making his voice rough. Now, more than a year later, those words seemed prophetic. Rebecca hadn't just been breathing, she'd been starting a new life, one that would eventually include him. I thank God every day for leading me to you, Wade said, his voice thick with emotion. For giving me a second chance at happiness. And I thank him for sending you to that crossing at exactly the right moment, Rebecca replied, for giving me the gift of your love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their land, Wade Wilson held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. From tragedy had come joy, from despair had come hope. The stagecoach crash that had nearly claimed Rebecca's life had instead given them both a new beginning, one they would cherish for all the days to come. Their daughter, Clara Rose Wilson, was born on a snowy December night, with both Henry Montgomery and the town doctor in attendance. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's quiet strength, and she brought an even deeper dimension to the love that had blossomed between Wade and Rebecca. As the years passed, their family grew. A son joined them 2 years after Clara's birth, then another daughter 2 years after that. Their ranch prospered, as did Henry's mercantile, which Rebecca continued to help manage even as she raised their children. Wade found a contentment he'd never thought possible, surrounded by the family he and Rebecca had created together. Sometimes on stormy days when the creek ran high, Rebecca would grow quiet, remembering the day that had nearly been her last, and Wade would take her hand, reminding her with his touch that they had overcome the flood, that they had found each other against all odds, and that every breath they took together was a gift beyond measure.